This piece is done on a 16 by 20 inch piece of paper, but you'll see that I've got it taped off at the top there just because I wanted the actual dimensions to be closer to, I think it's 12 or 13 inches tall. So while the pH neutral tape around the edge of the hot press watercolor paper, that's going to keep that in place. So as the paper gets wet, when it'll start to warp or buckle, and when it dries, it's going to dry back flat into shape. But that second line that's going horizontal at the top, that's serving no purpose other than to just keep a straight line where I want this to be. And it looks a little bit skewed right now. It's not, it's just the angle of the camera. Make sure when you do something like that, if you actually care where your borders are, measure that a couple of times. Make sure that you get that perfectly straight, or you are going to run into trouble later on. So the first thing that I've done, besides, well, actually, the first thing wasn't even taping it to the board. I taped it to my computer monitor and I traced it. This is a Patreon reference photo, so I'll link that below. You have full rights to copy this. Use this one in your own work for prints or to sell the original. You're welcome to that. It was one of those photos. Now, the way that I got my image onto the paper so that it's very clean, I don't have a bunch of eraser marks all over the place, which can cause problems if you spend too much time erasing. When you go to blend the graphite over it, and especially when using the water-soluble graphite, when you blend it, it can make the paper so that the texture is slightly different and it's kind of noticeable. So it's better if you're not doing a ton of erasing when doing your initial drawing. While I do use the eraser later on, that's a little bit different because it's a part of the artwork. Here, just getting the initial line drawing done, whether you want to freehand it or trace it, I would still trace it onto the finished art or the paper that you're going to be working on. If you want to freehand it on another piece of paper and then trace that. But in my case, I just taped it directly to my computer monitor using my masking tape and then traced over that. And then once you get it traced on there, I did use that one is the HB graphite, water-soluble graphite pencil here. And so that when I start to blend, none of these lines are going to stay harsh. They will all blend out as I add water to it. Now, once you've got your line drawing on there, the next step is to start layering in the background. Now, a couple of things I want you to notice about this step. Look at how my pencil lines are going all over the place. I've got really harsh start and stop points. This is super sloppy. If you're working in water-soluble graphite, you get to be super sloppy. That will blend out completely. There's no real reason to spend the amount of time that I normally would in doing the little circles and making sure it's overlapping and you're not getting any of those start and stop points. If I was doing a normal graphite drawing, I would really struggle to get rid of all of those. You would see it, but because of this being water-soluble graphite, you can be sloppy, you can be lazy. I'm gonna go ahead and encourage you to do that just to save some time. This background was horribly time-consuming, but I really like the results. Now, a couple of things I do want to address just because people had asked me over on social media. Why didn't you use fill in the blank? I had multiple suggestions. You should have used pan pastels. You should have used this. You should have spray painted. You should have. Why? This looks amazing. It's difficult. I'm not going to lie. This background is not easy to get as solid as we're going to get, but it has such a nice matte finish, beautiful dark black. I just love the look of water-soluble graphite. So this is going to eat through about for something this size, I ate through about an entire HB pencil. Luckily, they're not super, or 8B, I'm sorry. They're not super expensive, but yeah, this is going to take some time. Just, you've been warned. So starting, I don't want to rest my hand on the paper at any point because people oils are not archival. It's kind of gross. So I'm holding my hand up, or I can use a maul stick, and then later on I will be using glassine where I want to rest my hand for more stability. But here, I don't need to be super stable. I can be really messy, and we're just going to fill this in. It is just going to take some time. Now this piece, one of the things that you want to keep in mind, something like this where we're copying a reference photo, the reference photo's already been edited. The original photo had a green like it was a day photo taken in the day. There was, I think, a building in the background and maybe some green leaves and grass and stuff. Looks nothing like the photo. I've already used my creativity in editing the photo to look how I want. Once you get to that, and we're basically just copying it, this is going to be more about your technical skills. So go into it knowing it's almost like a run of patience. You've got to be super, marathon of patience, I guess I should say. You've got to be super patient. This is just going to be very time consuming copying what you see here. And a lot of people will do, well, what's the point? You've already got the photo. because you're improving your technical skills. One, the finished piece is beautiful. It's one of my favorites, but you're really working to improve your technical skills here. And that is something that is extremely valuable. Just go into it understanding I'm going to be spending a lot of time at this easel doing repetitive work. And so we'll actually speed through parts of this because it is very, very repetitive. Now, I am not pushing very hard. My pencil also does not need to be super sharp for this, unlike when I normally work in graphite. Normally with regular graphite pencils, you need it to be really sharp because you want to make sure that the tip of the point of the pencil is getting into the nooks and crannies of the paper. You don't need that here. With being that it's water soluble, it's going to dissolve right into the paper. You don't need to worry about that grainy, gritty look. Here, I'm jumping straight to my 8B. This is the darkest pencil that comes in the set. If I were doing this with regular graphite pencil, I would likely start with an HB pencil or maybe a 2H for my base layers because it's a harder lead. It'll get into the nooks and crannies so you don't end up with the grainy, gritty look as much. But with water-soluble graphite, this isn't something that we need to worry about. So when I want to get my darkest dark, I can just jump straight in to the darkest pencil I have. Now, it is going to take multiple layers in order to get this to be as black as I want it to be. That you'll see after a few times of blending this, it's not super dark. Water-soluble graphite is a bit odd. It's not as permanent as, let's say, Inktense. So let's say you do a layer, you blend it, you do another layer and blend over it. It's not going to... It doesn't lift as much as watercolor or reactivate as much as watercolor, but it does still move again. It's a very interesting thing to work with that you are going to have to get the hang of. So if you're not getting it to blend smooth at first, don't be too frustrated with that. And I would practice doing something like this on a smaller scale first. Get the hang of doing this before you jump into something this big. Now, a couple of things. If I were to do this again, I would actually mask out some of the lighter areas along the edge of the tiger's face. Using masking fluid, I would use along the bridge of his nose, his eye on the outer edge, his chin. That fur just ended up way darker than I wanted it to be. Did it ruin the piece? No, it just wasn't. I couldn't get it back as light as I wanted to unless I wanted to use another medium on top of it. I could use white gouache. I could use a white colored pencil. You've got a few options there if you need to pull white highlights back over. Here's the thing. Water-soluble graphite has this almost grungy look to it. Like it's a little bit of a warmer tone than what you would get with regular graphite pencil. Regular graphite pencil to me feels a little bit cooler, a little bit closer to blue, whereas the water-soluble graphite, when I blend into this and I blend over the whites, it's going to stain it kind of a warmer tone. And when you go over with, let's say, water-soluble, or I'm sorry, with gouache or Inktense or any of those things, that would be archival. You certainly could do that, but it's kind of obvious. It is very obvious. It's not the same white tone. And so I like to avoid using those when possible here. But it is something, if you run into a situation where you're just like, oh my gosh, it got way too dark, I don't even know how to fix this, go ahead, whether it be a white colored pencil or gouache, Inktense, any of those would be okay to do on top to pull your white highlights. But it does have a different tone than the white of the paper when you've had the water-soluble graphite blending over it. So just something to be aware of, something to test out. You may like the look of it. It's not an issue so much of right or wrong. It's going to be personal preference, but make sure you test that on another piece of paper before you find out that you don't like it maybe, or again, potentially that you think it's amazing. So we fill in the entire thing. I actually went over it more than that. You want a lot of pigment on the paper. So this is about what we should look like at step 2. I've listed this as step 3. It took me 6 layers to get this. I actually made little marks you can see at the top of that paper because I wanted to be able to tell you guys how many layers it took me. 6 layers to get this flat, this black. And the way that I'm going to do this initially was with a paintbrush. The way that I finally got it really smooth at the end was just using my fine mist sprayer with distilled water. Now, I do recommend using distilled water. Tap water could start to yellow over time. We don't know. They put so much crap in our tap water. I don't recommend it when you're doing something like this. If you need it to be archival, go with distilled water. It's inexpensive. It lasts a decently long time, but that's going to be a lot safer. But I used the distilled water in my fine mist sprayer towards the end. So if you're getting to where you're just really streaky, you can't get it this smooth, don't panic. We're going to fix that towards the end of this layering process. So I'm starting with a Taklon bristled filbert. This is a 1 inch or a 3/4 inch, anything like that would work. And I'm just dipping it in my distilled water and going to paint right over it. Now you can see this is just kind of a light gray. It's not super dark. Now I would not jump to the fine mist spray or mop brush for the initial layers here because this is going to allow me a bit more control as I work around the tiger to keep everything more defined. But it will be fairly streaky and it dries pretty fast. Like it's very much like ink tints in that it starts to dry, and when it dries, it's kind of hard to get rid of some of these brush strokes if they dry with a harsh line. So here I'm using a mop brush, or technically it's a powder brush. You're like, what do you mean a powder brush? Makeup. It's a makeup brush. Ulta has them, or actually Amazon. I'll put a link in the video description for the supplies here. Now see, as I added water to get it wet enough that I could blend, see how it pulls even more off, and I end up with like empty spots where it's not as dark as others. This is going to take a lot of layers. And the paper is going to start to warp or buckle. Don't worry about it. We're going to use a hairdryer and it should dry right back into place if you're using a quality watercolor paper. Now this paper actually comes in the blocks. It's the block form of watercolor, and in theory, you're not supposed to need to remove it and tape it to a board. The problem I have with it is it warps and buckles, and it does not dry flat in those big sheets. I really have not been happy with the huge sheets of block watercolor. Maybe I just use too much water, entirely possible. The smaller blocks, not as big of a deal, but when I get to something this size, I have better results just removing it and taping it to a drawing board like this. If you don't know what I'm talking about, if you look up block watercolor, it's sealed all the way. Like you work in the pad of paper, it's sealed down around the edges. So the equivalent of being taped down, except it's not as good. So not totally the equivalent. Supposed to be. I don't like it. Now I want to try to blend those out before it dries. You can see these heavy brush strokes actually brush stroke is the right word here, but you can see those heavier brush strokes. Those are going to be a bit harsh if I don't get those blended out. So again, using a different, this one actually is a mop brush. Hey, it's not a makeup brush for once. Now don't worry about if the graphite is going to pick up onto the mop brush. It just rinses right out. It doesn't ruin anything or stay there. So I'm using the same mop brushes I use for acrylic painting. It doesn't hurt this. I'm trying to be careful around my edges, but the only way to get that base layer as blended and dark as what, as solid as what I did, I'm going to have to blend into that tiger later on. And this is where I would have been so much better off if I had used masking fluid just around the edges. I wouldn't fill the inside in. Masking fluid's its own drama. It has a tendency to, one, it will pull off when you remove it. It'll remove a lot of those graphite lines. So you lose part of your drawing. The other thing is just kind of a pain to work with. It's a pain to apply. It's a pain. I'm not a huge fan I avoid it when possible. However, this would be a time if I want those edges clean, whether it be the whiskers, the hairs on the chin, around the edge, the eye. I really struggle to get that eye on the outer edge light again. It erases to an extent, but not as light as I would have liked it to be. And if I had used masking fluid, that would have prevented that. And I know I sound like I'm complaining a lot about this, like I ruined it because I didn't. I didn't. It's fine. I worked with it. But that would be something I would certainly do different and recommend for anywhere where you want it to stay really light. Now, the thing with masking fluid is you don't want to leave it on very long. So if I applied it, I want to make sure I'm done with that background and remove the masking fluid within an hour or two. I don't want to leave that masking fluid on there for days at a time. The longer you leave it, the harder it starts to almost bond. It adheres too much to the paper and it makes it a lot more difficult to remove. So never leave masking fluid, even the masking tape around the edges of your paper. You don't want to leave that on too long. The longer it sits, the longer it starts to bond and makes it much, much more difficult to remove. So that's pretty messy. We dried it completely with a hairdryer and you can see very, very blotchy. So now I'm going to just repeat the same thing. I'm going to take that pencil. You can see super sloppy. Doesn't matter. The goal is just to get the pigment or the graphite onto the paper. I don't care which direction it's going, but don't push hard. If you push hard, those areas, you end up with two problems. One, they end up with a bit of a gloss. The other thing is they don't blend out as well. So, and you damage the tooth of the paper, which limits how many layers you can get on top later. So I don't have to add pressure here. Very loose hand. You can see I'm holding the pencil to the side here so that I fill in more, just a lot faster than using the tip of the pencil. And you'll see at the end of this, while this is difficult and it is time consuming, there's so many people who had asked, well, why didn't you use other mediums that would be faster or easier? Because this looks amazing. I love the look we got from this. Or we can get from this, I guess. Grammar is not what we're here for. You're just going to fill all of that background in again. And then we're just going to paint over it. Now here, I'm probably 3 layers in at this point. So we skipped ahead of it. 3 layers of paint or fill it in, use a regular paintbrush. Now I'm starting to take a fine mist sprayer instead. And this is giving me a much, much softer base. But I would do the first few layers with a normal brush so you've got the edges clean around the tiger as much as possible. But watch here, the only way to get this smooth is to let it blend a little into the tiger. And this is where I darken areas that I'd rather have not. And I just keep misting that with a fine mist sprayer. You don't want so much that it runs. Now this is better if you lay it flat for this section, so you're less likely to have anything running. I think I left this on the easel for the first couple, and then after a few layers into this, I realized it's just a lot easier to lay flat. And see how I have to, the only way to get this really smooth, I've got to pull that a little bit into the tiger. Otherwise, if you're too careful, trying not to get any of this blushed or brushed into the tiger, that is going to leave you with a halo look around the tiger where it's very, very obvious that that background, you were too afraid to go up to the subject. So I would much rather see you cover the tiger a bit than not go close enough and end up with that halo look. The halo look looks terrible. I just keep misting, keep it wet. And then once I get that blended pretty well, I'm going to go ahead and take my hairdryer and dry it so that the paper pulls back tight into shape. Now, good watercolor paper will pull tight into shape. I've used several in the past that didn't, or it wasn't even watercolor. One of the worst was the colored pencil paper. That stuff was horrible. But if you get that wet, whether it be with my brain just shut down, paint thinner, your odorless mineral spirits, there we go, that's the word. Or in my case, I had also tried airbrushing it. Just slightly getting things wet caused a lot of problems and it never went back into shape. Whereas a good watercolor paper, and while that isn't listed as watercolor, it should be able to handle it. Any good paper should pull back like this does. So I did that, I repeated that process again, and this is just skipping through. Again, I mentioned earlier, it took about 6 layers to get this where I wanted it. And I just kept repeating, put it down a layer with the pencil, then blend it out with the fine mist sprayer. Here's a better angle using that fine mist sprayer. This is my final layer. Just lightly going over that. Don't get too wet. If it's too wet, when you go to brush it, it's just going to start lifting off. I'm very lightly going around this. And there we go. Now, I did not record a lot of that blending. It was just a repeat of what you just saw. And you're going to repeat that until you get it to look how you want. Maybe yours takes 10 layers. It doesn't matter. As long as you're using a light hand, you can repeat that process until your background looks how you want. Try to keep it off the tiger. You can see I've got a little bit on there. The chin, unfortunately, was my biggest, the chin and the outer eye were my biggest 2 complaints. You'll see that later on where I erased so much trying to lift it. And I got it lighter, but not where I would have liked it to be. So that would certainly be a great place for masking fluid if you've got it. My last tip on that background, and this is why I did not record a lot of that final blending there, you've got to go fast. I couldn't worry. In order for me to get this smooth, I couldn't worry about the camera that was in my way. I had to keep scooting it out of the way. You've got to work very, very quickly because as it starts to dry, that is going to start to streak up on you, and then you've got to do another layer to fix it. So that is certainly something to be aware of. Another tip, one thing I tried as I was working on this, because I was resting my hand on the glassine, it was rubbing too much on right around the edge of the tiger's face. And I didn't realize that until I got further in. And just the pressure of my hand on the glassine, rubbing back and forth, it started to make the background a bit glossy. Not a lot, not super, super shiny, but a bit more. Most of this background, when you use water-soluble graphite, it's going to have a very matte finish. But mine was starting to gloss up just a bit. So the fix for that was to go back over. Actually, my first attempt was to take a paper towel and rub over it to smooth it out. It made I polished it. I made everything in the background shiny. So I had to go back over it again with a bit more graphite and another mist with a fine mist sprayer, and then smooth that out. And that did bring back the matte finish. So if throughout any of this, whether it be the background or even on the tiger, I had areas that were shinier than I wanted. One of the things I love about this look is that it is very, very matte, or it can be very, very matte. So when I go over the stripes of the tiger, if I'm pushing too hard with that pencil, or if I'm working it back and forth too much, you start to polish it. It is still a graphite, and it'll start to polish and start to get a shine. Now, it's not that a shine means you ruined it, but one of the things I like so much about the water-soluble graphite is it's flat and it photographs beautifully. I want to keep that, and so I'm trying to avoid shine as much as possible. If you start to get it, usually if you go over it with a bit of water, it will go back to being matte. On to step 4. Now, I do also want to throw out there, that first step took me an entire night. I mean, hours and hours and hours to get that to look the way that it does. Totally worth it. I'm so happy with that end result, but don't think you're going to rush through that either. Like, that's going to be its own project. Even though I know you're going to be excited and want to start on the fur and the tiger, plan on that background's going to take you at least a night. So, or possibly longer, depending on how fast you work. Just want to throw that warning out there. So the next thing we're going to do, we're just going to focus around his eye and the fur just around his eye. Don't try to do the entire tiger all at once. We want to focus on little zones. This is going to make it easier to tackle, easier for you to pay attention to that reference photo and really copy what you see. Now, these pencils, they range from HB, I think it's HB, 2B, 4B, 6B, and 8B. And when you're working, it is such a pain because you have to constantly look. And for me, my eyes are bad, so I'm constantly trying to look and read the little numbers at the edge. I finally, after I think the first couple of hours of working, I had enough, and I went and painted the back end of all of the pencils so I could quickly look and go, okay, the one with the white back end is HB, yellow was 2B, orange was 4B, what was red or like a burgundy color was my 6B, and then dark purple, so it just looks black, is my 8B. I just used acrylic paint. It made such a difference for me. So starting here, I'm just working on the darker areas around the eye. I believe I'm using a 2B to start with here. You could just jump to your 8B. The problem is, and this is going to be one of the determinations of should you use a 6B versus the 8B, because they're very similar. Once you blend them out, they're very, very close. The darker the pencil, the softer the lead. So it's not going to hold its point as much. The harder leads, the ones that are going to blend out lighter, like the HB and the 2B, they have a much, much harder lead. They're easier to get your tiny fine detail. They're just not as dark. So with everything, you've got pros and cons, and you need to weigh those pros and cons. Okay, is it more important right now that I have super fine detail? Then I want to go with one of the leads that are harder, meaning the HB, 2B, one of those. Or do I need it to be as dark as possible? Then I can go ahead and sacrifice that sharpness for a softer lead, but it's also going to be darker. So that really is what it comes down to when you're deciding, I don't know if I should use an HB or a 6B. And you can get away with doing most of this with just maybe a 2B and an 8B. Like, you don't have to use every single pencil that it comes with. You can simplify a lot by just using a couple of them. Now, a quick little tip, if you want something really light, take your pencil. So this one is either the HB or the 2B, it doesn't really matter. Take your pencil, scribble on a scratch piece of paper. Now you can take your paintbrush or a water brush, either way. This one is the paintbrush that came in the set. Add some water. Now I can use that to paint directly on an area where I want it to be really light. Lighter than what I would want with maybe using even the HB. So it's just a little bit of color there, or tone. Throughout this, don't go too dark too soon. It's very difficult to lighten things back up. You can lighten them somewhat with the eraser, and we will be using erasers a lot, but you're never going to get that paper back to white. It's not the same. Once you've added water, it stains the paper. So you're never going to get it as light as you would with a regular graphite. Or even if you're using charcoal, sometimes depending on how you worked it, you can bring that paper back up to pretty light. This, once water is added, it is stained. You're only going to be able to lighten it a bit. Fairly certain I'm using a 2B here. It's not a big deal one way or another, but I did want something that was a little bit harder. So a 2B, an HB, a 4B, any of those would be okay. I wanted something that was, while it will get dark once I add water, I needed it to be able to keep its point. So that's why I didn't jump straight to the HB. And or 8B. I really didn't use the 8B until I get further in layer-wise. You can always go back and darken something. It's very, very easy to darken things up. It is much more difficult to lighten them. Now, a lot of the time, it's going to feel like everything is too dark, but once we get towards the end of the tiger, you'll realize you can go a lot darker on everything, and that's fine. I would much rather you go too light throughout the entire piece and have to go back, and it's easy to darken things up. Do that instead. But because we're up against so much of the white of the paper right now, everything's going to feel a lot darker than what it actually is. So there I'm using the Derwent water brushes. I prefer them to at least the one Faber-Castell, and maybe I just have a one-off that I don't love. It doesn't hold as much water. The Derwent water brushes I really like a lot better for blending things out. And you can just use a paintbrush. You don't have to use a water brush, but they really do simplify things. You just squeeze the water out of the tube, and I still put distilled water in those. You squeeze the back end of them, and I always squeeze it or dab it onto a paper towel first, because you can get a big drop of water and it's too much water for the artwork. So I always dab that on the paper towel that's under my easel. So those really are, it just saves so much more time than dipping your regular paintbrush in the water. And the water is right under where I'm working, my cup of water and the paintbrush, but those water brushes are amazing. And there are other brands, I've not tried them all, but of the ones I have tried, Derwent, hands down the best. So here, it looks like I'm using the 2B. I'm just darkening up some of these stripes that are already there. Now, how much detail you should add into your work is going to be up to you. Some people want more detail than what I've got drawn out. Some want less. That is going to be completely personal. There's no right or wrong. The only way you're going to find out if you are the type of artist who likes more or less for your initial drawing is to try both. Sometimes try using less and see if it's easier. Sometimes add more lines and see if it's easier. Sometimes, though, I find if you put too much detail, it actually makes things harder. There's the HB. You can see it's very light. It makes it harder if there's too much detail because you just get lost. There's just so much going on. So the majority of what I have are always going to be the eye and the nose. In the case of a tiger or an animal with any sort of print, I will really define those dark areas and then give the hint of which direction fur needs to go in, but I'm not going to try to draw in every single little clump of fur. And right now I'm focusing on mapping out my general lights and darks. You can see I'm not really worrying about little marks of fur themselves. Those come later on. And this is just a very repetitive process, so let's speed this up a bit. There's the 2B. It's a bit darker in this spot here. Defining those spots a bit more. Now, if you get an area, a clump of fur or a spot, and you realize, oh, that's in the wrong spot, don't worry about it. It does not need to be exact. Your eye needs to be in the right place. The nose needs to be in the right place. The fur can be adjusted somewhat. So there I use the water brush to lightly go over everything. Just blend that out. Now I'm going to darken these even more. Probably using a 6B or a 4B to darken those. You can see I'm not super concerned that it's exact. It's not that big of a deal. Grab a pencil and use it. If it's not giving you the results you want, grab a different one. I'm going to dry that. Now, there were areas where I let it air dry because I thought, oh, it's just a small area right under the eye, no big deal. And when I came back the next day, it did dry. It was just buckled. You'll see this later in the video where every time I push on it with a pencil, the paper would kind of move or push in. Once I put water back over that whole area and then dried it with the hairdryer, that went ahead and dried it back flat into shape. So it wasn't like luckily this paper is good, so I was able to fix that. So I'm just using the brush that these came with. Now, I don't care if there are brush strokes, but I do want to make sure if I have brush strokes, they're going in the same direction as the fur. See how I'm pushing that out? I'm pushing the brush so it moves the direction that the fur does. Now, how do you know when it's time to blend with water or to keep layering with pencils? Doesn't make a big difference one way or another. If you blend too soon, it's not even too soon. You just let it dry or take the hairdryer to it and then go back over it with some more graphite. So there's no rule as to, like with colored pencil, I'll often say I do 3 to 5 layers, then blend with OMS, then 3 to 5 more layers and blend with OMS. With this, I don't find that it makes a big difference. You can blend sooner. So let's say I have the same amount of layers total, but I blended more times in between each of those layers. It's not going to damage or hurt anything. So you can't go wrong if you blended too soon or didn't blend soon enough. You're just going to play with this and figure out what method works best for you. But you're not hurting anything by blending too soon or not soon enough. The pencil, the graphite really does behave very much like a watercolor pencil in that when you blend it with the water, it really blends out well. Like it spreads out all over the place like a watercolor would, or even Inktense. So it's not like colored pencil in that where colored pencil, you kind of dissolve it in place, but it doesn't spread out a lot. This will spread out, so watch that. So right now I'm just working on my values, or sort of working on my values, mapping it out and getting a general idea of where my lights and darks go. But I am definitely going to have to come back through and darken a lot of this more later on. And we're going to go ahead and speed this up just a bit. Taking that hairdryer to it. And this is what I was talking about where I've got the glassine that is under my hand. And as I'm rubbing that, my hand's pushing on this area here right next to the tiger's face, that started to polish the graphite underneath. That's where I had to go back over with just a bit more pencil and the mop brush in order to smooth out. So an alternative would be using a maul stick. If you need to rest your hand, I can rest the maul stick against, or a broom handle would work. Anything would work. I can rest that against my easel so nothing's touching the artwork and then rest my hand to stabilize it against that. But you got to figure out what's most comfortable for you. And normally that's not a problem with the glassine. It was just me moving back and forth as much as I was. It did start to cause a little bit of a shine. Now I'm starting to get the hint of some of that fur. Either an HB or a 2B would be good here. I'm using that HB and starting to get more of a hint of fur. My two favorite erasers for working with this are the Tombow Mono eraser, that's what I'm using there, and I have an electric eraser. I think it's Kohl something, the brand of electric eraser. I've not found to be make a huge difference, but an electric and the Tombow Mono. And it works best, I found, once the paper's been dry, like overnight. So it was dry to the touch, but I had blended recently. And when I came back the next day, I got it as light as I possibly could on a couple of areas. And it just wasn't as light as I wanted, especially when I get to that outer eye. But when I came back the next day, I thought, oh, I'm going to see if I can erase some more. And a lot more did come up. So there was something about it setting longer. It seemed dry at the time, and it wasn't damaging the paper to work the eraser over it. But once I let it set overnight, I was able to lift a bit more. Since I use this little water brush, I am working it in the direction of the fur. So I'm creating little fur marks with it. This would be another area that I think the masking fluid would be very helpful. There's two little like eyebrow hairs, whiskery type texture right above that eye. And I lost those throughout the piece, so you can't really see them. You couldn't see them that much in the reference photo, but that would be an area that masking fluid would be very helpful for. And I would just put it on while I was working around it and then remove it when I was done working on that area for the day. But don't leave it on too long. I'm lightly blending again. And when you look at your reference photo, notice that we often will look at the black stripes and think, okay, dark as I can go, the whole thing black. Really look at the photo. Where are the highlights? There are areas that are going to need to be lighter. So it's better if you don't jump to your 8B pencil for all of the stripes thinking, okay, as dark can go straight, get it as dark as I can get it. No, go kind of a mid-tone like I have here. That one was done with a 2 and a 4B. I didn't jump straight up to my 8B. Save that for the darkest darks. If you go too dark to begin with, it is a lot harder. You can lighten it some with that eraser, but it'd be so much easier if you started in this mid-tone and then darkened it up as needed. But don't assume because you look at a stripe and quickly think, okay, black stripes, black, dark. Watch that on your reference photo. Where do they get darker? Where are they a little bit lighter? I mean, yeah, at a distance, it all looks solid black, but really look at those values. Starting to get some of the little marks of fur here. Going back and forth between the 2B and the 8B or HB here, because that's going to hold a finer point. So I'm just pulling them out from the black. Now, you don't want to make your black lines go too thick when you initially draw those out. Make sure you're allowing for room that you can continue pulling. See, I'm pulling the black into the white areas or the lighter areas to create the marks of fur. If I had pulled those stripes a bit too thick, a bit too far out, when I come back on and pull additional over the white, because you can't pull the white over the black, it doesn't work like that with this medium. So if I had not allowed enough space, when I pulled the black over, my black lines just keep getting thicker and thicker and thicker. So plan that out when you're doing your initial drawing. Remember, you need to leave room that you can pull it out a bit further so that it looks like the white is overlapping the black. Now, as you start pulling the hair in, really watch the direction. It's easy to look at the reference photo. Okay, it's going this direction, and you just go to town making individual lines over and over again. Two things wrong with that. One, fur changes direction constantly, and that is very important to pay attention to because that is what determines the underlying bone and muscular structure. You start putting fur in the wrong place or it's going in one direction, you just made a weird, flat, deformed cartoon. So that's something to watch. The other thing is, this is not just a bunch of individual lines put all over the place. It doesn't matter if you put a million individual lines. It doesn't make it look more realistic. You want to watch how these group together, where they're overlapping. So you almost have sort of V shapes the way the fur clumps. So it's not just individual lines. The individual lines looks like a bunch of confetti or worms all over it. It doesn't look like fur. I don't care how many you add. It's not going to make it look like fur. Detailed, yes. Fur, no. You really want to watch how this fur clumps and clusters together. Don't feel like you need to try to put in every single individual line in order to make it look like fur. That's not how you create that texture. It's not about how many lines. It's about which lines, how they clump, how they cluster, which direction they go into. So if you're doing a bunch of individual lines, you want to watch how they overlap. That's the solution here. Either overlap them or they're almost weird little shapes, not lines. Look at the reference photo as abstract shapes. So this is one of the reasons that we're zooming in and focusing on just this one area versus kind of skipping around doing the ear and the forehead and the face and everything all at once. If we focus on one area and pay attention to those little abstract shapes, it's going to make it easier for us to capture the actual movement, the actual shape of fur. But don't think more single lines, like just a bunch of individual lines. That will never really look like fur. It always has a very stiff, very fake look to it. And notice as I start creating fur, and this will be more obvious as we get farther into it on bigger sections, a lot of those lines, I'm not lifting the pencil as I create those shapes. Don't do little line, little line lift, little line lift, little line lift. Sometimes yes, but it's not everything. See how that pencil's not lifting? A lot of what I'm creating is almost a zigzag back and forth. Now, when I say zigzag, don't take that too literal. We don't want actual zigzags. But a lot of these shapes, you don't need to lift the pencil in order to create all these individual little lines. Now I'm coming back through. This one I believe is my 6B, darkening up these darker areas. Now I'm going to put the tightest detail on this closer to the eye, and I want to fade my, and this is personal preference, I like to fade my detail out as I move away from the focus. I want the focus on that eye. I should want the focus on the background after all the time that took, but I want the focus around the eye. So as I move out, even though the reference photo has more detail, let's say along the back of the tiger, I'm going to lessen and lessen the amount of tight, clean detail I add. And this is going to help keep that focus just centered around the eye here. So even after I get this section done, and I'm making air quotes you can't see, when I get this section done enough to move on to the next section, at the very end, I'm going to spend some hours really refining the detail closest to the eye. I'm going to focus on getting these stripes in. Make sure they're shaped how I want. Don't worry if they're a little off, doesn't need to be perfect. See how even here, the shading in there, I'm still moving that pencil the direction of the fur. As always, work upside down if you need to. That can be really helpful for paying attention to these little details. We have a tendency, we look at it and our brain's like, okay, stripes, got it, done. And you go to town working on those stripes without looking at the reference photo enough. Flip it upside down. You're forcing your brain now to see the shapes, and your work will have a tendency, as awkward as it feels to work on it that way at the time, your work will have a tendency to be much, much more accurate when you work upside down. You're forcing your brain to see what's there and not what it thinks is there. We're going to go ahead and speed this up quite a bit because we're just repeating the process. And that's really this whole lesson is just largely repeating the same thing again and again and again. There's no like crazy new technique that's going to come in at some point. We're just repeating the process. Look at that reference photo and copy what you see. I'm pulling these strands of fur out from the black using that one. Looks like the H, actually I think that's the 2B. That was a really light area, started with the HB. I'm going to come with a darker pencil here. I believe that's the 2B. The 6B would have been fine. I didn't need to go this light here. I was probably just being lazy and it's the pencil I grabbed. But a 6B would have been fine. You see how I'm not pushing hard. Keep a very light hand throughout this. As long as you don't push hard, you never hit a point where you can't do more layers, or at least I've never hit a point where I couldn't get more layers on there. The type of paper you're using will make a difference. Certain papers are not going to take as many layers. They may be too smooth, they may be too rough. So you're going to have variation there depending on the brand of paper you are using. Now I'm coming through, there's the 8B. There's my darkest dark. I'm going to go ahead and start putting some of these darks into the darker stripes. And see how we're just focusing on one zone at a time. If you start trying to do everything at once, you're going to lose sight of things. Things end up being very, very sloppy. If you break up, you could even break it down to 1 square inch at a time, whatever size you need to go with, and just focus on that until it's perfect, and then move on to the next one. When you look at something like this that has so much detail, if you work on a zone that is too big for your comfort level, you are going to make a hot mess. It's overwhelming, and you start rushing things and things don't look so good. When that starts happening, that's a pretty good indication you need to break it up into a smaller section. So here I'm really doing this one big area around the eye. If that feels too much, if you start losing sight of where you're doing, break it up into a smaller section. Going to dry that really well. And back to making little fur marks. And again, I'm not lifting the pencil in between each one of these. See how they're clumped? I've got a few individual ones, but look how they move in rows too. That's another big thing to notice with fur. Fur and grass is very similar. You typically will have sorts of rows, and I don't mean straight lines. We don't want anything to look unnatural, but notice the way that the fur will move in these clumps, in these rows. And these, even if I am putting individual lines, they have to overlap. They're not confetti. They don't want to be all separated. A few of those are getting too much separate, like looking too separate. I'm going to have to come through and group them up better. My goal as I do this, I want it to look, when I work on one zone at a time, as finished as that zone needs to be. But the reality is, I know once I get more into this and start getting the other values around it, I'm going to come back and make a lot of adjustments, whether it be detail or in my values. So try to make it finished, or that zone like start to finish as done as it needs to, you know, or none of that is coming out right. Try to make it look like what you expect the end result to be, but also know you're going to come back and make some changes later. So that is the step 4. This is what you want your work to look like before we move on to the next zone. Now we are going to move on to the bridge of the nose and that outer eye area that I got way too dark, that I've been complaining about from the beginning of this. You know, the interesting thing about that too, as the artist, we have a tendency to pick and choose areas like, okay, I would have done that differently. That's too dark, whatever the thing may be. But that doesn't mean that the end result is bad or that it's not beautiful as it is. So don't be, you know, I'm making jokes about this, but I don't actually care. I love the end result of this piece. So don't feel like it's not exactly what I planned on it being. It didn't come out perfect, therefore I don't like it or I need to start over. Don't worry about that. Learn to, when something doesn't come out quite how you wanted, work through it. Figure out how to make it work. So what I'm trying to do is lift some of that graphite. And I also kind of misshaped the head on the top here, so I'll have to do some erasing there right along the edge when I get closer to the ear. It's off camera, but a lot of that has to be reformed a bit. And that eraser did lighten it up a lot. It's just not as light as what my initial plan was. Practice with those electric erasers. They can get out of control really quick. You touch it to the paper and it kind of takes off on its own. So definitely practice with that before you hit your actual project. We're going to speed this up just a bit because it is a repeat of the same techniques we were doing on the last step. See how I move that pencil the direction of the fur? Watch how there's another area that had the rows. You see that Tombow mono eraser? Definitely for graphite, the Tombow mono eraser is such a must-have. It's got a really tiny point, so it makes these little areas much, much easier. You want to use, you can either get a drafting brush or even a paintbrush is what I use because I can't find my drafting brush right now, but something that's not your hand to brush away any eraser marks. Don't use your hand across this. See how I can erase that? As dark as that background is, with that eraser, I am able to get some of the little hairs. I hint of them. Are they as light as my reference photo? No, but they're good at that. It actually works fine for this. We're just pushing that back into shadow a little bit. Another thing you can do is take an eraser like this and cut it with a razor blade so that you've got this flat area and you can erase that way if you don't have a Tombow mono eraser. So I'm just holding it so the Tombow mono eraser I like a lot better, but that is an option if you've got like another type of eraser. You can kind of trim it. Coming back through with the pencil just to sharpen or thin out because those lines were a bit too thick. Gotta watch the direction of the fur again. Here's one of those rows I was talking about. Now, if this was an area where I had put the graphite, but it hadn't been blended with water, it would erase very, very well. It's just because the water forces it to stain the paper. I love this too because using that eraser, it creates this almost fuzzy outer edge. I've talked about before, sometimes we want a harsh, crisp edge. Sometimes we want it to just fade out. Don't feel like everything needs to be a harsh, crisp edge. It makes things look very flat. By paying attention to where should a line fade and be soft, that's one of those. I want that outer edge just to kind of fade into the background. I mean, you can see the line of where it ends, but it's not a harsh, crisp line like it was created with the pencil itself. It's very, very soft. And back to paying attention to the direction of the fur. That is today's theme. Which direction is the fur going? Now, as we go down the bridge of the nose, this is going to be the same for a lot of different breeds of dogs. We don't want to make that look super, super fluffy. This fur is so short. We want the texture without trying to make so many individual lines that it looks like it's got long hair on the bridge of the nose. Or muzzle. I don't know what we would call that part. We're also not here for anatomy. Reshape that a little bit. I had it too flat from the background. I'm using a paintbrush. It goes pretty fast, but I'm just using a paintbrush to brush away my eraser shavings there. It'll be so tempting to just use your hand. Don't do it. You get the oils of your skin on your work, and it can make it almost shiny in those areas where you've worked your hand over it, just because of the polishing of the graphite. So we've got the darker area, and see how it's just getting that solid base. I'm not worrying about individual strands of fur. We're just going to put the hint of those later. Switching up to my HB where it needs to be really light. I think an added bonus too of really focusing on these individual zones. Work on them until they're as finished as you can get it at that stage. And I say that just because we know we'll go back and make adjustments later, but still try to get it as close as possible. These give you little wins. Being that it is so technical, being that it is so detailed, it is very time consuming. And if you're working on too many zones at a time, too big of areas and that take too long, let's say I did the entire head in one go, it's going to look like crap for days at a time. Whereas if I just do the area around the eye, within a few hours, that whole area looks nearly finished. It looks really good. You get these little wins. These are little bits of encouragement that will help you to keep up with this level of detail, because this is time consuming. This is very, very tedious to do this level of detail. But if you are getting all of these little wins where you can see that end result, you can see that it's all worth it because you've done, pretty basically finished certain areas of this, I think that that will help you to keep going and really get that level of detail in throughout the entire piece. We've got some rows again, watching the direction in the fur. Look how these clump and cluster. One of the big mistakes I had made, and why I keep bringing this up, when I first started trying to make animals look realistic, I mainly worked in painting, so it was a little bit different. But I would do the entire body of the animal, get my base layer, and then try to do all the next color. I would do that all in one layer, and then the next color all in one layer, instead of zooming in on one specific little spot and really paying attention to what's on that reference photo. And my work definitely showed it had a very cartoony look to it because I was rushing through everything. And you keep thinking, well, I'll just keep layering until it looks good. Yeah, but when you're doing the entire animal, the entire subject all at once versus one little zone, you're probably not going to do as many layers. While you technically could make that work, you're probably not going to get as many layers as you should have, because it just gets kind of frustrating and well, tedious. When I started working in one little area at a time, it was just a night and day difference on my finished piece. I'll lighten that up before I go over the details here. So using that eraser. Now notice the bridge of the nose, primarily it's just shading, more solid shading. It's not as much with the individual hairs. While I will come back and put some of those in, I'm really focusing on the general lights and darks there. You're going to let that be smooth. So now I'm using my 8B. We're going to go ahead and get some of those darks a bit darker. And I switch back. I want to say this is a 2B. And we'll blend that. As I start to blend, I want to pull that brush so it moves with the fur. I don't want to just wipe it back and forth any which direction, because that's going to lose those lines. You don't have to blend everything with the water brush. If you do a pencil line and it looks, any given area you've done with just the pencil, it looks perfect how it is, leave it alone. Not everything needs to have the water over it, but the water will get rid of any shine that you've got if you started to get too much shine on any area, and it will smooth out any rough lines. So if it's a little bit gritty looking or grainy where you don't want it, that water brush will fix it. We're going to use a 2B. Come back through here, start getting some of these darker areas. You can really push that pigment around with the water brush too. This is a great example when I talk about all the time, the colors don't really matter in a painting so much. It's your values. Dark's dark enough, light's light enough. This is what makes something look realistic. If it was about the color, then black and white paintings and drawings would never look realistic. It's always the values. Yeah, the color makes a difference. It plays a role, but it is not nearly as big of a role as we like to give it. The shape and the form is created with your values. We often think if I just knew the color that that artist used, whether it be a portrait or anything else, my work would look more realistic too. No, that you could use completely different colors and have it look just as realistic as long as your values are there. And if that is something that you struggle with, work on your black and white pieces or sepia tones, whatever, two-tone, less colors. That will help you to perfect and make things look more realistic. So when you do include other colors, it's going to be a lot easier because you've got such a good understanding of values. As I come through here, I'm starting to get the hint of fur, but not a lot. See how it's just in a few areas. Shape the nose out a little bit better. Here's another area where I pulled the dark in a bit too much. Let's lighten that up. I used my hand to get rid of the shavings there. Don't do that. That's such a bad habit. A little bit of eraser was just stuck to the paper, so I just took my nail and scraped that away. I'm going to create some texture with that electric eraser and see how I'm just dabbing it in a few areas. I'm not trying to make some solid look. I'm just kind of dotting. This is a great way to get the look of a bit more texture. I'm spending, every time you see me pausing, I'm either sharpening with my pencil or looking at the reference photo. Spend more time looking at your reference photo than you do your actual artwork. If that's something that you struggle with, one of the things that I used to do for students that I really could not get them to look enough at their reference photo is I would time them. Okay, for the next 30 seconds or the next minute, I just want you to study the area around the eye or the area around the nose. Just really look at it, because too often, it's a skill, or I guess yeah, skill, I guess would be the right word, that you have to develop. A habit, that's the word I'm looking for. It's a habit that you need to develop where you're just constantly looking back at that photo. And if you're newer to painting and drawing, the more that you paint, the more that you draw, the more that you're going to start noticing things. So you may not even notice a lot of the detail that the next artist does. Don't let that discourage you or make you feel like that's not something that you can do. I just don't see what somebody else is seeing. That comes with time and practice. It's not some magical thing that you either have or don't have. That only comes from painting and drawing more. The more you draw, the more you're going to start noticing these little details. So don't let that discourage you. See how these pencil strokes are grouped together as I create this fur, not just individual lines. This is going to be the same. Let's say you're painting a Doberman or a Greyhound, super, super short fur around the face. You'll get, or really with a lot of these breeds, just around the entire body. Start by getting these general lights and dark shaded in, and then just put a hint of fur in a couple of areas. Don't try to make the whole thing look furry or you have a weird, overly fluffy Greyhound. See, teeny, teeny little lines using the HB there, so it's really light. Okay, there is the end of step 5 where we've got the eye and around the bridge of the nose. Our next step is going to include the ears around that area kind of behind the jaw there and the whiskers and chin. So this is a big, big section. We're going to speed this up a bit because this is the technique exact same as what we did before. We're just paying attention to the details, watching the reference photo. Where are our lights and darks? So I'm going to start by erasing some of the fur on the chin, and I'm pulling some of this out into the black of the background as well, so that I don't have such an even line all the way around the chin. Now this would be an area you may want to consider using another medium like a white colored pencil. Higher wax-based content typically is going to be more opaque, or gouache. But remember, if you do add that in a couple of areas, you're going to want to add that throughout the piece. So if I pull highlights with a colored pencil here on the chin, because it really was darker than I wanted it to be, I'm going to want to pull that around, whether it be the ear or around the eye, a few other places, so that it balances it out, because it is very, very obvious when you use a colored pencil. It's not the same white tone. So the alternative to worrying about that is go ahead and use it, but add those little hair marks, add a bit more with the highlights with the pencil or with gouache or whatever you choose in other areas of the tiger, so it feels more intentional. If you were to do something like that, let's say just on the chin or just around the outer edge of the face so that it shows up against the black, that is going to be pretty obvious that it wasn't so intentional. But if you put it everywhere, now it looks intentional. And that's actually just a good tip in general. There was a musician years ago, I want to say he was a jazz musician, doesn't matter for the story. Point is, he played guitar, I think it was, and he was amazing. And he was known for never messing up. And people had asked him, how do you never mess up? He's doing these really intricate pieces. And he said, oh, I mess up all the time. But when he does, he repeats that screw up throughout the rest of the song, so you think it was on purpose. And that's something that we can definitely take into our art. When something goes wrong, or something like, let's say I were to use a pencil that was obvious it didn't match the rest of the piece, then pull that into other areas of the piece so now it looks intentional. Now I'm taking my 8B and I am pulling that up into the white of the chin. So now that also helps break it up and make it look more fluffy instead of a straight kind of line around the chin. Now you want to be careful in this area where I'm blending the really dark shadowed area of that chin that's right between the chin and the whiskers into the background. Don't overly blend that, because you'll start to lift off some of the graphite from the background. Luckily, because we have so many layers there, it's not too bad. Or I should say, it would take a little bit more effort there to lift it because there are so many layers, but that is something to be aware of. I'm doing the same thing. I'm pulling some hair around the edge, and then I'm going to come in and start creating the little lines of fur. Now notice how these go in rows too. It's not just individual hairs all over the place. They're clumped together, clumps and clusters. Now, the whiskers don't need to be white start to finish. This is an area that I actually like, that the ends of them were really dark. It makes it look like they're fading more into shadow. So I'm not trying to bring those quite as white or light as I was trying to get some of the fur on the chin. So parts of the whiskers I do want light, but parts should be darker. And that's something, no matter what medium you're working in, watch that, because we have it. I know I do it all the time. We'll just take white and make the whiskers straight with that, but they're going to look more realistic and look better if there is variation where part of it, like on the end of these, just kind of fades into the shadow. It helps them to look slightly more curved. When it's just a straight white line, that really flattens it out. So no matter what medium you're in, it's better really look at your photo. Look at how, well, for one, not all of the whiskers would be white anyway. Usually you'll have a mixture of lights and darks, but look at how parts of the whisker the light will catch. I'm just going in between these whiskers and thinning them out. Right now they're pretty thick, especially if you use an electric eraser, or even with the Tombow Mono eraser can be pretty thick, but the electric eraser more so. Your lines are on those whiskers are going to be thicker than what you want. So you want to come back through with your pencil and thin those out. And I'm using the water brush just to blend that. Now the pencil is going really quick here. This is sped up quite a bit because the pencil technique, it's the same as we've been doing so far. Don't rush this. Don't try to make yours go that quickly. What will happen, not only will the work come out looking like crap just because you're rushing, but also if you're moving the pencil too fast, you start to polish the graphite. So you start to get that really shiny look. One of my favorite parts about the water-soluble graphite is how matte it will dry. So don't move that pencil so fast. And here's more obvious the way everything moves in rows. Using my 8B, no, my HB, I'm lying to you there, and lightly going over everything here. And moving that water brush the direction of the fur. You can't be really crazy when you're blending things out with this. You're not just going to wipe it across entire, the whole face. You'll smudge things around. Remember, it's a bit more permanent than watercolor. It stays put a little bit better, but it's still going to smudge. It's still going to move. So as we move that brush, ideally move it the direction of the fur. So when you do have brush strokes, it looks like intentional fur. You can really see how sharp that pencil is there so that we can thin these whiskers out. Look how tiny those little pencil strokes are there. That fur is really short, so we're going to make really tiny strokes. Where it's really short, just dots are enough. You really want to watch too. It's very easy to get in the habit of you make a few pencil strokes and you get comfortable with that specific stroke, whether it be how much pressure you're adding, the direction you're moving in, or the length of that pencil stroke. There needs to be so much variation. You're going to be changing all of that constantly. So don't just keep repeating the same motion. Yeah, it looked good when you made a couple of lines like that, but when you keep doing the same way over and over and over again, it's going to look like weird, stiff confetti. Whenever we're dealing with anything that's natural, stuff that's not man-made, there's got to be a lot of variation. Unless you're getting into something that's very, very stylized, but that is not what we're doing here. You can see how many times I rework an area. So I've already done these whiskers. Then I take a step away, I come back and refine them even more. And I continuously do that throughout the piece. So as I work back into the ears, back into the body, I'll still keep coming back and making adjustments to the head. When you've sat for so many hours and looked at one area, you'll start to miss things. And when you back away, take a little bit of a break, work on another area, you'll notice things you just hadn't noticed on previous areas you worked in. Another thing that's going to start happening is as I fill this in and I get more with the ear and into the body, I don't have as much of the white paper exposed. It makes it more obvious where I need to adjust my values. Right now, because of that white paper, I feel like I'm dark enough on that face. I'm not even close. I'm going to come back later and just rework the pencil over the areas that I've already done. So it's not a lot of work. The detail stays. I'm just going to darken up some of these areas later. But when you're up against the white of the paper, even though you think, well, you've got the black on the one side, so that should help. It does help, but I'm still nowhere near as dark as I need to go. And that's one of the great things too. So I keep talking about the chin wasn't dark enough or the outside eye, or not, sorry, backwards. The chin wasn't light enough or the outside eye wasn't light enough. Yeah, but when I get everything else darker, those areas will be lighter. So sometimes if you have an area where you feel it just not bright enough, you can't get it any lighter, make what's next to it darker. Then the reverse is also true. If you have something that just is not dark enough, make what's next to that lighter, and it'll make your darks appear that much darker. So we often work or think more single-mindedly on this needs to be lighter, so I obviously need to lighten it up. It's not always that simple. Sometimes it's more a matter of making what's next to it darker. So I'm going to move on to this area, and I'm making sure that these stripes are really well defined so I don't lose them. This whole area, if you look at the reference photo, it's based on the reference photo. It's not exact. It doesn't need to be. When you get into the bigger clumps of fur, don't worry about making those exact. I keep saying the eye, the nose, the ears, the outside shape of the head, those are things we want exact. But when it comes to the individual clumps of fur, close is close enough. If you hit a point where you realize, oh my gosh, I put a stripe completely in the wrong, I made an area that should be light, I made it a dark stripe, work with it, let it be, that's okay. The only time that's going to be a problem is if you're doing a pet portrait where the markings need to be exact to that pet. But when you're doing wildlife like this, none of that really matters. And there are times I put in extra stripes or extra little spots because I think it balances the piece out better. Remember, don't go too dark. I'm going to dry that completely. Notice on the stripes, I've got areas, kind of patches there that are lighter. It's not just as dark as I can go all the way through. This is where your highlight is going to be. So now I'm coming through with the 8B. We're going to darken up the darker areas. Notice the areas that we need to leave light. If you are having a hard time making yours look realistic, spend more time. That was one of the simplest things that made the biggest difference in the world of my work when I was working with doing a lot of graphite portraits. I was doing what was the equivalent of a graphite sketch, I would say. It wasn't really a full portrait where it looked like a black and white photo, which was my goal. But I was spending maybe 45 minutes and just doing a headshot of dogs. And they were selling, $50. You're not making a ton there. So it was worth the effort, I guess. But I wasn't happy with how it looked. And I knew I could do better. And the thing that I did, and it made a night and day difference to the point where it didn't even look like it was done by the same artist from one piece to the next, was instead of spending 45 minutes like I normally did, well, what happens if I spend 8 hours? It was huge, the difference. I jumped into something that now looked like a black and white photo. And let's say you get to a point where it looks really realistic, even at 8 hours, but you still want it even more. You want to move towards hyperrealism. More time. I mean, that's really the difference between an artist who is working in photorealism versus hyperrealism. Hyperrealism is the type where it looks like a photograph. You can't tell that it's a painting or a drawing. Whereas photorealism is obvious. It looks realistic, but it's obviously a painting or drawing. Like this one here would be considered photorealistic. Those who get into hyperrealism, you can do that. It's more a matter though. Let's say in something like this, I spend 20 hours. If I wanted to do hyperrealism, I would probably spend 150 hours. I mean, it's that much more time. So that alone can make a huge difference on what that end result is. If you're not happy, you feel like it's just, you're not enough detail. If you like more time is often the answer. Slow down and spend more time on each individual square inch and really focus on those little zones. Spend a ton of time on 1 or 2 square inches at a time. But also, I should throw out there, I don't feel that hyperrealism is of higher value or it means you're a better artist. It just means you spent more time on something. So it's something that's cool. But I personally, you're not going to see me do it because I have zero interest in spending that much time on one piece. I just do not have the attention span for it. So, and I'm perfectly happy with how regular photorealism works. So don't feel like that hyperrealism has to be the end goal. It absolutely does not. But if it is something you're wanting to do, it's the same exact techniques we're doing here. You're just going to slow down and spend more time and be a bit more precise on little things. The other thing, if you do want to get into hyperrealism, one of the things you're really going to do is work larger. The larger you work, the more detail you can easily fit. It will make your life much easier. And that's not to say that there aren't hyperrealism pieces out there that are on the smaller side, but it is a lot easier to get that level of detail the bigger you work. A lot of the pencil strokes I'm making here, I am not lifting the pencil. I'm keeping it down as I sort of zigzag back and forth. I am adjusting the pressure I'm adding when I switch direction, so I don't have a hot spot at the end of each pencil shift, like direction shift. But a lot of what I'm doing, these are clumped. That pencil didn't lift that entire little section. So work on, when you're doing some of these clumps and clusters, keeping that pencil touching the paper the whole time. You don't want to just keep doing pencil stroke, lift the pencil, next pencil stroke, lift the pencil. Now there is sometimes places that you're going to do that, but a lot of this, as I'm adding this in there, I want to leave the pencil on the paper. And when I say zigzag, don't take that so literal that you've created a chevron pattern. We don't want that either. But you can leave the pencil still and start, or on the paper, while you form these shapes, these clumps and clusters of fur. Here I am using the 6B, and I am starting to pull some of those black lines out into the white. And what this does is makes it look more like the white is overlapping the black. Again, here, a lot of what I'm doing, that pencil is not lifting from the paper. So on this ear, I first want to define where do I want my darkest areas, and that's with the 8B again. And that is going to fade out in the background in several areas. And this is more solid. We don't have as many fur marks here. Now we've got some hint of fur. And if you get to where you're starting to stress that your white areas aren't really white, they shouldn't be anyway. I mean, some areas you can certainly be lighter than what I've got here, but white is never really white unless you've overexposed an area. It's going to be it picks up all the colors around it, or in this case, values. So if, let's say, you took the route and started using masking fluid, I would still add shading on top of that. I wouldn't leave the paper really anywhere on this, just straight white. Here we're back to shorter fur, so really little lines. That didn't come out right. I've lost a lot of my initial drawing here because it is so dark when I blended over the background into the tiger. So now I'm just mapping out where some of these are. I'm not super worried about detail being perfect. I'm definitely going to be coming back through this, but I at least want a general idea of where I want some of these lines. We're back to those rows, breaking up or pulling some of the black lines into the white or light areas. And then within those, we've got rows of the way the fur separates. Back to that 8B, really darkening some of these up. And look how I skip areas though. Leave some light where those highlights are hitting. You can see as we add this fur, look how much darker each of these patches gets. So this is why it's so important to make the areas underneath light enough to begin with, because it's just going to get darker as we layer details. Now, as I blend those little areas out with the water brush, I'm using one with, I think it's a number 1. It has tiny, tiny little round bristles. And I'm not blending over the whole area, just over the individual lines so that they have a softer look. But I don't want to smudge that all through or I'll lose the light areas too much. This is one of my least favorite areas of any portrait to work on or animal subject is the inside of the ear. Really go slow, take your time. This is going to be a long process. You've got so many little lines in there that you want to make sure you're capturing all of the clumps of fur here. We have a tendency, and I've seen this so many times, where artists will just skip over or rush through the ear. Don't. As much as you look at it and think it's an ear, it's not that exciting. Yeah, but if you rush over this, it will pull down the quality of your entire piece. No matter how great the face is, you skip over this and it's pretty obvious. I'm going to go ahead and shade a little bit out farther away from the ear just so that I can keep my place a little easier. Really watch the shift in direction on the ear, the fur in here. Using the HB, so it's really sharp. There, for the darker areas, switched back to the 8B. I think for something like this, it's also going to be very helpful to continuously turn your drawing board as you work. I'm keeping mine flat at the easel, but it really, if I weren't recording this, I would probably have this on my lap, turning it as I go continuously. I think it makes it easier to get a natural pencil stroke that way. They actually have easels I've seen photos of where it turned like it was attached in the center, and the whole easel kind of turned sideways in different directions as you work, not the usual front and back like we normally see. This is another area. Look at how much that pencil is staying on the paper. I'm not continuously lifting it. This isn't a bunch of individual brush stroke or pencil strokes. It's actually one big pencil stroke in many areas. So I switched over to the 2B. The 2B and the HB are going to be your best bets for getting tiny detail where the pencil stays sharp. Using that 8B again, so that's going to be my darkest dark. And that ear, this is sped up a decent amount. That took hours. So go slow there. Don't plan on that being something you're going to get done really quickly. A lot of what I'm doing here, these clumps at first, same thing. That pencil is staying on the paper. I'm not lifting it between pencil strokes. Lifting it between clumps, just not individual pencil strokes. So here, just mapping out the stripes again and the main shadows between the bigger clumps of fur. Now I'm going to include the colored version of this photo along with the black and white, because sometimes it's hard to tell, okay, is this a stripe or is this just a deep shadow in the clump of fur? And I think if you can look at the colored version and see the answer to that, it may make everything make more sense to you as you're working. I mean, realistically, you just need to copy what you see, but it still can be helpful. So I'll include both those photos. So I'm going to erase some on the leg. One leg stepping forward. I just want a hint of the light catching there. This whole area is really deep in shadow. It's one of the darker areas on the tiger, so I've gone quite a bit darker. And I'm still moving that brush the direction of the fur. So when I get those streaks, it just looks intentional, even though it very much is not. And here, I'm just smudging what was already on the brush from blending the dark areas onto the light area. So I'm not even having to shade all of that in. You just move around what's already there. Now you can really see, as this is in real time, look how that pencil occasionally lifts, but look how it stays on the paper for the most part. And when it does lift, it overlaps the previous pencil stroke. And there's the 8B for the darker areas. I'm lightly going over everything here where it still needs to be a lot darker. If you need a pencil extender, I did have good luck with fitting these into the Derwent, the silver one. So it's the larger one, but I had to shove it in to really make it fit. But it did work well once I shoved hard enough. The Derwent pencil extenders come with a black and a silver. I have had some, though, where it felt like they were tighter than others or handled bigger ones better. So I actually have several packs of those I've purchased. And if one isn't fitting well, try another. But the silver is the one that will fit slightly larger pencils. Here I'm using the 6B. So a bit of a harder lead than the 8B, but not quite as dark. But it will give me, or hold its point a little bit better. See how I'm moving that water brush in the direction of the fur. Hair dryer, you can almost see where it pulls the paper back into shape where it really warped because that was such a large chunk that was wet, but completely flat again. I'm using the 6B, and we're going to come through and really define these little chunks. Especially right up against the edge of the lighter fur. See how the pencil's staying on the paper? Don't keep lifting it. When you do lift, it needs to overlap other bits of fur, not individual confetti marks. Sometimes that tape, especially when you're using the pH neutral tape, will start to come up. So I just push it down as I work occasionally. It also will be more likely to come up or let loose when it's gotten heated with the hairdryer. Smooth out a bit on the leg there. It's a bit choppy from that eraser. You know, as the camera's at a wider frame, you can really see the end of my pencils now. If you are wondering, the one with the white on the end, that is the HB. The yellow on the end is a 2B. The orange end is the 4B. The red end, kind of a deep burgundy, is 6B. And then the short pencil that is just dark, it's actually purple, but you can't see because dark, that is the 8B. What I'll often do is use a lighter pencil, so a harder lead, let's say an HB or a 2B, to get my initial lines on there, and then go in the center area and just darken that up a bit with the 6 or the 8B. So here I have the majority of the detail in the definition. I just really want to darken this area behind the ear. Don't push too hard. You don't need to. You can just do a lot of layers to get the pigment on there. There's no need to push hard with this. Using that 8B or HB and going over this entire area to darken that up. With the HB, you can do shading where it doesn't have to be blended out with the water brush, but it'll still kind of look like it was. It'll blend on its own. Just don't overwork that, working back and forth to where you polish it again. And if it does polish, just go over it with water and it'll be matte instantly. See how that pencil still, even when it lifts, it overlaps, but largely it just stays in place. There is where I keep lifting it, but it overlaps the previous mark. So there is step 6. We're finally getting somewhere. We've got the majority of the neck blocked in, or the big shadow under the ear, and the forehead and ears. So the rest of this actually gets much, much easier moving forward. For this next step, we are going to fill in the basic shapes and shadows for the back. Believe it or not, that's not finished. We're going to go back and do more details on top of this. We're going to get everything loosely blocked in and then a bit more detailing behind the ear. We're going to speed this up just a bit. This is, again, just a repeat like we've been doing of everything else on a slightly larger scale, just because we're working farther into the back, so the fur is getting longer. Fur on the top of the head still pretty short though. So I'm going to go ahead and map out the bigger dark lines here. I use these as sort of zones too. So when I start doing the detailing, I'll do that big chunk between this zone and the ear. Now I've got most of that mapped out. I'm switching over to my HB, lightly go over everything, although I quickly realized I need to get some of these areas a bit darker, because once I went over with the HB, I couldn't see many of them anymore. So I'm using the 6B. I'm just going over what's already there for the most part. Now you can still see the clumps of fur that I did before, even though they're a bit blurry. So when we come back through with the detail, we really want to focus on refining those same clumps. It's not about just going through and adding a bunch of new little lines. I mean, we'll add some new ones, but really define what we can see there. Even if some of those little clumps or clusters were almost accidental, like it was just a brush stroke left from the water brush, work with it. Turn that into a clump. Using that 8B there to darken up the stripe. It will help me to better judge the values next to it. Using that HB to darken more areas around the ear. Now that I've got the shadow behind the ear, I can see where I want to go a bit darker inside. So this is what I was talking about a little while ago, where once you get one area filled in and you're no longer up against the white of the paper, it becomes much more apparent that you need to go darker on other previously finished areas. You see how much darker I can go here now? It's just so much more obvious that I'm too light. You want to depend more on your values. Dark's dark enough, light's light enough to make this look realistic than the individual detail. You can have the most perfect detail, every hair in the exact right spot, but if your values are weak, everything is just kind of mid-range, the piece is very boring. You would be much better off to have the strong values, and especially on a piece like this where that's really important in the overall look. But get those darks really dark, those lights really light, even if you didn't put as much effort into creating all the little clumps of fur. It will still be more striking and draw more attention than the artist who put in every little strand but didn't bother with focusing on values. I've told this story many times. There was an artist over in an Italian Greyhound group I was a part of, and she was one who put in tons of work on the little tiny details, but her work was very boring to look at, as detailed as it was, because everything was light to mid-range. She had no really light lights and no darks at all. Like, it was very, very bland because of that. So it doesn't matter how much detail you put if you're not getting those values in there. Dark's dark enough, light's light enough. This matters more than the color choice when you're working on a piece with color. It matters more than your detail. This not only gives your subject more form and makes it more, my brain just shut down. It makes the viewer look longer. It draws the attention of the viewer. I'm coming through and darkening up the majority of this. Even the light areas need to be darker. That whole section's way too light. Same thing as before. Let's just map out where our definite stripes are using my 6B here. See how I'm just smudging the dark lines into the light there? This whole area is not going to be anywhere near as detailed. I want that detail to fade out as I move off the page. So just being smudgy, let those brush strokes work with the direction of the fur. We're going to darken this even more with that 8B. Really should go find that pencil extender. This whole area needs to be a lot darker. So see, I'm just taking that pencil, going over everything. There, I'm using the 6B. And I'm not really worrying about which direction it goes in. I just need to darken this way up. I'll define the little clumps of fur a bit better later on. But if this isn't dark enough, the light areas won't appear light enough. And this really needs to be dark. And then we're going to darken it some more. I've removed my glassine there. I am not resting my hand on the artwork at all. I'm just keeping a loose hand, so I don't need any control. But it makes it much easier to see where I just need to darken things. And even the face, you can really see that face. Well, part of it's overexposed right now from the video, but there are a lot of areas on the head that need to be darkened. I'm lightly going over that. I'm still moving the water brush in the direction of the fur. Now, something to note about that water brush, it is not soaking wet. I have been dabbing it on the paper towel. You're not trying to oversaturate the paper here. So I'm coming through. This is what I was talking about before, where now that I've got everything else in, it's very easy to see how much darker I need to go. So my continuous complaints about the chin's not light enough, that outer eye is not light. Once you get everything else in, none of that really matters much, because everything needed to go darker anyway. But I've got to get everything else darker to make the fur on the chin and on that outer eye stand out enough. Back to defining the whiskers. I'm using my 8B to get a lot of the shading in here. I'm sorry, not the 8B, the HB. That is the worst. They're too close together and I keep mixing them up and they're the exact opposite pencil. HB. can tell by the white tip on the back there. Now, I'm not pushing hard, but that pencil is sharpened. It's not a long point, but it is actually pretty sharp. And I'm not so much worrying about making the clumps and clusters of fur as just darkening what's already there. This isn't really so much, I mean, I'm adding a little bit more detail, but it's much, much more about correcting my values. Here I'm using the 6B. So here I am defining the clumps of the fur, or darkening them, adding a few more individual strands, but again, mostly focused on just making entire areas a lot darker. And this is the point of the drawing that I find to be much more enjoyable, where everything starts coming together and every little change you make can make it look so much better. Like darkening up these stripes. That is with the 8B. Hey, I got it right that time. Now look at the transition between the stripes here, where I've got the darkest dark and it fades out to a middle dark, maybe like a 4-8 or 4B level dark. I don't think that's the pencil I used. I didn't use that one very much through this, but point is about that level of dark, kind of a mid-range. Look how it fades from dark to mid to the lightest light. This is going to be very typical on tigers or leopards, cheetahs, anywhere, any animal or subject where I've got those dark, dark stripes. There's always this transition. And even when I do it in color, I normally will transition from the black to a magenta before I hit the tans or oranges in this case. So that is what you're seeing there. It's not just black stripe up against white. You do that and it looks very, very flat. Okay, and there is what your work should look like at this step before we move on to the final step. You can really see here too with that photo how overexposed the video is, unfortunately. It's just the lights that I work under really lighten it up more than it should, but that is what you want yours to look like before we move on to those final details. Now on to the final steps. We're just going to adjust a few details and we will be finished. I'm going to start with the electric eraser and I'm just going to dab in different areas. What I'm doing, it's not so much tiny detail, but I'm creating more texture in the look of some of this fur, especially the short areas. So I'm just dotting for the most part, lightening some areas up. Now, one of the things that's really interesting, if you look at this video how overexposed the whites look super, super bright. And even the background has more of a dark charcoal gray. How dark these pencils look is definitely going to depend on the lighting you're under. Right now, as I record this, the piece is sitting next to me in a darker room and the background is just pitch black. The whites are more muted, kind of a stained, grungy, off-white look, which is one of the looks I love about this medium. It's very unique. It doesn't look the same as regular graphite to me in person, but close, not exact. But when you bring it into an area like this where I'm under super, super bright lights, look at how that background is hitting. So it's not even an issue of one is more accurate than the other. It's more about what lighting you have this under. Now, the whites are definitely overexposed here, but you can really see that background where it fades from like a gray to a dark charcoal gray versus what it looks like in person in a darker room that is dark, like almost black. I'm just dotting here and there. Picking out a few areas that I want highlights on. This isn't going to give me tiny, tiny detail, but it will give me those dots, and those dots are pretty small. Now going back to the lighting causing such a difference in how this looks, I would definitely, if you're selling work with the water-soluble graphite, I would definitely take a video and post that so that the buyer would understand what it looks like under different lightings, we're not here for grammar, different lighting, and turn the camera so you'll see, so that the viewer can really see how that shifts. Whenever you're selling things, you want to make sure that you're presenting it in the most accurate possible way. And there's going to be variation based on people's computer monitor and how the photo was. But I really want to make sure that the buyer isn't getting any surprises when they get that piece. And I think video showing it in different lightings and at different angles can really help with that. Plus, it's just a good sales thing anyway. Like, people really like to see what that looks like in video. It just seems more real than seeing just a photo. So both is a good idea. Both are a good idea. Again, grammar, not what we're here for today. And this section is very, very slow. You can see I do not have glassine under my hand like I normally do, but I'm not resting my hand at any point on this. Now, this last day of work, I probably spent over an hour, and I did not record all of it because you can't, it looks like I'm just moving my hand around and nothing is happening. But what I'm doing is, once I pick up the pencils, I'll be going in between a lot of the areas where the clumps of fur are already created. I'm just going to go in between what's there and darken the areas that I want to look like the deepest centers of the clump of fur. So you're not necessarily creating a ton of new fur. We will some on the back of the tiger, but when you get into the areas that we've already put a ton of work into, like around the ear, on the face, I'm really just working with what's already there more so than creating new lines. Now I'm just dabbing the little dots there. Now be careful when you're using an electric eraser. If you burn your eraser down too far and you don't readjust it, pull it up again, you can accidentally hit the paper with the metal that holds the eraser in place, and you can ruin things. I mean, you can have a huge scratch. Good luck fixing that. Sometimes you can hide it, sometimes you can't. Be aware of how far down that eraser is. And with a lot of these electric erasers, the eraser itself doesn't fit super tight inside of it. And so when you add any pressure, the eraser pushes back into that metal casing or the little holder thing, and then the metal is more exposed again. So really, really watch for that. One of the things that I've had to do on erasers in the past is take a little piece of masking tape, or any tape really, just stick something like one little ring around the base of the eraser, and then I shoved that back into the metal casing. If you've not used an electric eraser, this won't make sense, but for those of you who have and have messed with the refills, you understand. So I basically just made the base of the eraser thicker by wrapping the tape around it, and then shoved it back into the metal tube. And you have to play with it a little bit on how much tape you want in there to hold it in place. But that made it so that the eraser fit more snugly and wasn't sliding back as I worked. Now, typically when I do something like this, the portrait, I want the strongest, sharpest detail in the face, and then I kind of loosen that up as I move away from the subject's face. This helps keep the attention of the viewer on the area that I want it to be. Here, I did plan on putting more detail around the back, but what was interesting is I had taken a day of working on other stuff and hadn't done much work on this. And when I came back with fresh eyes, I realized I really liked how loose this was. I just thought it was incomplete, and that's, you know, we'll come back and put a bunch more detail. I did not end up adding much detail because when I came back and looked at it with fresh eyes, I just liked how soft the back end was. So you'll see as I work through this, I'm holding the pencil to the side, I'm using my 8B, I'm just giving a little bit of a hint of the lines here. Now notice I'm also not just doing line, lift the pencil, line, lift the pencil. This is doing what we were talking about before, where that pencil for each little clump is touching the paper. It's not lifting, I'm keeping it in place. I'm gonna darken this up. This isn't giving me detail. I mean, you can see where it looks a little bit shinier there. Once I go over it with the water, it'll come out more matte again. But giving yourself a day just to not really look too much at the piece, or look at it when you walk by, but you're not sitting there for hours on end staring at it like you are when you're working at it. You might change your mind on how you like something that you felt was just going to need a lot more work. You look at it with fresh eyes and think, I like how this is now. That's one of the fun things as an artist. You don't have to copy things exactly as the reference photo is. And if you look at that reference, this whole area has a lot more detail. There's the 8B in the Derwent extender. I also wanted the back end of the tiger to be a lot darker, so he was really coming out of the shadows. I'm holding that pencil to the side. It's not giving me detail, but it is filling that area in a lot faster. Now here, I flip the pencil back over where I want the smaller detail and see how I'm going into the deeper shadows. I'm not creating a bunch of new clumps of fur. I'm working with what's there and better defining them. And while these clumps of fur are similar to the reference photo, they're not exact. So if yours may look a bit different than mine. The point is that you want that variation where the insides, the center of each of those clumps of fur, you want it to look deep, like it's really in shadow, and this helps make the fur look fluffier. Also notice that the fur where it's facing the viewer, so the area right in front of the ear, at the upper kind of base of the ear, and then right behind the ear as the fur was changing direction on the neck. A lot of that fur is aimed at, even inside the ear, it's aimed at the viewer. And so when you get into the areas like that, you're going to have more little dots and smudges, not lines. If you try to force lines where they don't go, you just flatten that fur out. But this fur looks like it's aimed at the viewer because of those tiny little short things. It's not that the fur looks shorter, it's that it looks like it's changed directions and aimed at you. So here the fur is a bit more flat, so you can see we've got these longer clumps versus that fur more around the ear, behind the ear, and in front of it, we've got shorter dots, shorter little sections. Here again, just darkening up some of these stripes. Now these areas, you may look at it and go, well, it's a lot darker. I just wouldn't blend that out. You can choose to do that, but these, depending on how you turn the piece, it'll look a bit more shiny. So my main reason for blending that out is just to keep that really flat finish. I'm not really blending it where I'm pulling so much into the lighter areas when I do that. I'm more just kind of keeping it in place so that it flattens that wow, I can't talk. It gets rid of any of that gloss. Now here I am moving that pencil so it's going with the direction of the fur. Using the 8B or HB, so that lighter pencil, and I'm just lightly going over areas that are too bright. I'm going to tone that down. And the adjustments I'm making are not necessarily the adjustments your piece needs at this point. It's just you take a step back here and make those final choices. This area needs to be darker. This area needs to be a bit lighter. It just depends on what yours looks like at this stage. See, I'm mainly keeping as I blend this, pulling a little bit out so the hair layers into the lighter areas, but for the most part, I'm keeping it more in place. I don't want to smudge this too much into the lighter areas or I will darken those way up. At this point, you should be taking more time stepping back away from your art, looking at it and the reference photo at a distance, flipping them both upside down. And then at times, put the reference photo away and decide what would make your piece look better. That reference photo is just a guideline. It's not something where you have to make everything exact. See these little chunks? This is where I was talking about with an area where the fur is aimed at the person or angled at the person. Just little tiny dots in there, or smudges. They're not dots. This is a really good example of an area where I'm just refining what's there. I'm not creating new little clumps. I'm not doing anything like that. This is just in between what's there, making it darker and sharper edges. One of the things you really want to watch, I know I mentioned this earlier, but you may have a small area you blended out and think, well, I'm not working on that right now. I can let it air dry. You can, but your paper may not dry flat. It may buckle there and stay at a kind of warped shape. That hair dryer does such a great job, even on a small area where you may think, oh, I'm working somewhere else that can air dry. I would still use the hair dryer to make sure that it stays flat. Depending on the paper you're using, it may not flatten out at all. The lesser papers definitely have an issue with that. And there is our finished tiger. If you draw this guy, please tag me on social media or post it here on Patreon. I would love to see how yours comes out.